When I first bought the ranch out on the west edge of Maple Creek, I never imagined my life would get tangled up with a bunch of suburban control freaks who called themselves the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. The name sounded peaceful, Silver Pines, like some quiet mountain retreat, but the reality was anything but. My property sat just outside the main subdivision, a spread of about 12 acres of rough pasture and pine-covered slopes that had belonged to an old cattleman named Ray Miller. When Ray passed away, his kids didn't want to deal with the land. I made them an offer, fair and simple, and the deal closed before the ink was dry on the listing. It was supposed to be my peaceful retreat from city life, a place where I could breathe, rebuild the old barn, maybe raise a few horses again. But peace, as I'd learned soon enough, doesn't last long when a bunch of HOA zealots think they have a say over your land. It started small, like these things always do. A week after I moved in, I found a folded letter tucked under my truck's wiper blade. I thought it might have been from a neighbor welcoming me, or maybe some local contractor dropping off an ad. Instead, it was printed on thick white paper with a gold-embossed logo at the top that read, Silver Pines Homeowners Association. The letter informed me, in the most passive-aggressive tone possible, that all exterior modifications, structural repairs, and landscaping visible from the subdivision must be pre-approved by the HOA board. It went on to say that livestock were not permitted within Silver Pines boundaries, and that failure to comply with HOA regulations may result in citations and legal action. I remember standing there, the cold morning air biting at my fingers, reading that nonsense and laughing out loud. My land wasn't even inside their community. The subdivision began about 200 yards down the hill. My mailbox wasn't listed in their community directory. I was in the county, not inside any HOA zone. But they didn't seem to care about those details. The next few days brought more letters, one about my unpainted fencing being a visual disturbance to neighborhood aesthetics, another about construction noise coming from the barn restoration. Each one had the same signature at the bottom, Carol Bennett, HOA President. That name would become a thorn in my side for months. Carol was the type of woman who thought her clipboard gave her divine authority. I met her the first time when she showed up unannounced one Saturday morning, right as I was unloading a trailer full of lumber. She marched up the driveway in pressed khaki pants, her hair sprayed into place like a helmet, and said, "You can't build that structure without board approval." I leaned against the truck and told her calmly, "This structure's a barn, not a clubhouse. And it's on my land." She blinked like she couldn't comprehend the words. "Sir, Silver Pines has strict design guidelines," she continued. "We maintain property values by ensuring consistency." I asked her to point to my lot on her clipboard map. She flipped through her papers and frowned when she couldn't find it. "Well," she said stiffly, "I'll need to verify this with the county." Then she turned and marched back down the driveway, heels clicking like gunshots on the gravel. By that evening, she had sent the sheriff's deputy to my gate. Now, Maple Creek's sheriff's department knew me already. I'd done some construction work for the county a few years back, and one of the deputies, Jim Parker, was a good friend. When he pulled up, I saw the flashing lights and thought something might have happened nearby. But Jim just laughed when he stepped out of the cruiser. "Ethan," he said, "seems like you made some new friends in the HOA." He handed me a complaint form that Carol had filed, claiming unauthorized development and zoning violations. Jim shrugged and said, "We both know this is nonsense. You're outside their jurisdiction. Just keep your receipts and property lines clear." I nodded, thanked him, and asked if he wanted a coffee. He did, and we sat on the porch, watching the sun drop behind the tree line while he told me stories about other HOA run-ins he'd handled. Apparently, Silver Pines had a reputation even among law enforcement. They'd called in noise complaints on teenagers mowing lawns, threatened to sue a neighbor for painting his mailbox the wrong shade of black, and fined an elderly widow for leaving her trash bins visible for more than 12 minutes past collection time. They were relentless, and Carol was at the heart of it all. Still, I figured they'd eventually realize I wasn't part of their little kingdom and move on. I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. I'd wake up to find HOA violation notices nailed to my fence posts. Once, they even tried chaining my gate shut, pending compliance review. That stunt almost made me lose my temper. I called the county office, filed a report for trespassing, and sent the HOA a certified letter demanding they cease all contact. For a while, it went quiet. I focused on the ranch, fixing fences, clearing brush, and patching the old barn roof. There was peace again, the kind you feel only when you're working hard under an open sky, with the smell of pine and sawdust in the air. But Carol wasn't done. She was just regrouping. The real storm hit when I decided to install a new metal gate at the entrance. The old wooden one had been sagging for years, and I wanted something sturdy. I welded the new frame myself, heavy steel, painted deep green to blend with the trees. The very next morning, I saw two HOA board members standing at the road, snapping photos of it. I waved, trying to be neighborly, but they turned away. A few hours later, I heard the distant sound of sirens. I thought it must be an accident somewhere down the county road, but then the cruiser slowed, turned in, and stopped right at my gate. Out stepped Carol, flanked by two more board members, gesturing wildly as the deputy approached. I recognized the young deputy, new guy, not one of Jim's crew. Carol was pointing at the gate, saying something about unauthorized barriers, restricted community access, and public easement violations. The deputy looked confused but professional. I stepped forward, calm but firm, and said, "This gate's on my property, deputy. You can check the county map." He looked at his notes, then at Carol. "Ma'am," he said, "this isn't within Silver Pine's jurisdiction." Carol turned red. But it affects the appearance of our neighborhood. It devalues nearby homes." I remember her voice cracking like a spoiled child denied candy. The deputy apologized to me, said he'd make a note of the incident, and left. Carol didn't. She stood there on the gravel, trembling with rage. "You think you can ignore the HOA?" she hissed. "You'll regret this." Then she spun around and stormed off. That's when I decided I'd had enough. No more polite replies, no more hoping she'd stop. I was going to end this for good, but not with shouting or threats. I had something better, a plan. The first step was research. I started digging through public records, county maps, and property deeds. I learned that Silver Pines HOA was originally formed in 1994, covering 112 homes built by a developer named South Ridge Communities. The HOA was structured as a non-profit corporation under state law, meaning it had bylaws, officers, and, crucially, shareholders, the property owners themselves. What caught my eye, though, was a section in the original documents describing common area parcels, 3 small pieces of undeveloped land scattered around the neighborhood. Each one was technically owned by the HOA itself, not the homeowners. And one of those parcels, a narrow, overgrown strip along the north fence line, had accidentally extended onto my property during a botched boundary survey years ago. In other words, part of my land was still legally attached to the HOA's corporate charter. I met with a lawyer friend, Laura Chong, who specialized in real estate. She combed through the paperwork, smiling as she read. "Ethan," she said, "you might not just have a case here, you might have leverage." We spent weeks building the case, documenting the encroachment, the trespassing, the false citations, everything. Then Laura filed the paperwork with the county, forcing the HOA to either correct the boundary, or sell me the disputed parcel outright. I offered them $1 for it, just to make it official. Carol's board rejected it, of course, claiming they'd never sell HOA assets. But what they didn't realize was that their bylaws required an open vote for such matters. When we petitioned the county to enforce that rule, the HOA board was forced to hold a public meeting. And that's when the real fireworks began. The night of that meeting, I walked into the Silver Pines clubhouse, a bright, over-decorated room with fake plants and framed slogans about community unity. Carol was at the front table, glaring daggers at me. The other board members whispered nervously. About 50 homeowners filled the seats, most of them curious, some annoyed. I stood up, introduced myself, and calmly explained how the HOA had illegally extended its boundary, how their president had filed false complaints, and how their bylaws gave me the right to purchase the parcel. I laid out maps, deeds, and photos. When I was done, the room was silent, until an older man in the back spoke up. "If this guy's telling the truth," he said, "then the HOA's been overstepping for years." Others began murmuring in agreement. Carol tried to regain control, banging her gavel, shouting about order. But the tide had turned. The vote went through. The homeowners, tired of her tyranny, sided with me. The parcel was sold, for $1. It took 3 weeks for the paperwork to process, but when it did, that narrow strip of land became mine. And with it came a single share in the HOA's corporate ownership, because, technically, the owner of any common area parcel held membership rights. Carol had just handed me a seat on her own board. The morning I received the stamped deed in my mailbox, I couldn't help but laugh. It was one of those deep, satisfying laughs that come when life finally gives you the upper hand after months of nonsense. There it was, official, sealed, notarized. The HOA's own parcel now belonged to me. I poured myself a coffee, leaned back on the porch, and looked out across the pasture, feeling the kind of quiet victory that only comes from beating someone at their own game. For weeks, Carol had strutted around like the queen of Silver Pines, barking orders, filing complaints, and calling the cops on anything that didn't fit her perfect little picture of suburban control. But now, legally speaking, I was one of them. A card-carrying member of the HOA. Only difference was, I didn't plan on enforcing their rules, I planned on rewriting them. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. I knew Carol would try to keep me out, so I made sure to walk in early, with a folder full of documents and a smile that I knew would irritate her. The room was the same as before, sterile, bright, and overly formal. Folding chairs lined up in neat rows, that big, Silver Pines, a proud community banner hanging on the back wall. Carol sat at the head table, surrounded by her loyal lieutenants, Mark, the treasurer with a permanent scowl, Denise, the secretary who typed every word like she was documenting a war crime, and 2 other members who looked perpetually uncomfortable in her shadow. As I stepped through the door, Carol's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me," she said sharply, standing up, "this meeting is for HOA members only." I held up my deed with a grin. "Then it looks like I'm right where I belong." The room went silent. Carol's mouth opened slightly, then snapped shut. Her eyes darted to the papers in my hand. I handed her a copy of the recorded deed. "Parcel 17B, I said. "Officially transferred to my name, which, according to your bylaws, makes me a member in good standing with full voting rights." You could have heard a pin drop. Mark took the papers, adjusted his glasses, and muttered, "Well, he's not wrong." Carol's face turned a shade of red that matched the HOA's logo. "This is absurd," she snapped. "You only bought that land to cause trouble." I shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I bought it because your group trespassed on my property, and this was the cleanest way to fix it. Either way, here we are." She glared at me for a long moment, then sat down stiffly. "Fine," she said. "You can observe, but don't interrupt." That lasted about 5 minutes. The board started reviewing community concerns, which included everything from someone's mailbox color to a kid's basketball hoop being unsightly. It was like listening to an endless stream of pettiness. When they got to unauthorized structures, Carol looked right at me. "We have an ongoing issue with a resident who continues to build without permits," she said. "We've involved law enforcement, but further actions may be necessary." I raised my hand. "Are you referring to me?" She didn't answer. "Because if you are," I continued calmly, "you might want to note for the record that my land isn't subject to HOA authority, and any further interference will be considered harassment." Mark shifted uncomfortably. Denise hesitated, then whispered something to Carol. Finally, Carol exhaled through her nose and said, "Fine. We'll move on." The rest of the meeting was tense, but I stayed quiet, taking notes and watching her unravel. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in her own domain. Afterward, a few homeowners came up to me in the parking lot. They introduced themselves: Tom and Laura, a retired couple who'd lived there for 20 years, Amanda, a single mom who'd gotten fined for leaving her kids' bikes in the driveway, and David, a contractor who'd been fighting a citation for repainting his shutters. One by one, they started telling me the same story. They were tired of Carol's nonsense, her constant threats, her rigid interpretation of community harmony. That's when an idea began to take shape. I didn't just want to defend myself, I wanted to change the whole system. Over the next few weeks, I became an unlikely hero among the residents of Silver Pines. People started emailing me, slipping notes in my mailbox, even stopping by the ranch to talk. They wanted help fighting their fines, or advice on dealing with Carol's intimidation tactics. I spent evenings reading through the HOA's bylaws, discovering loopholes and contradictions they'd probably never expected anyone to notice. For instance, any member could call for a vote to amend regulations, provided they had signatures from at least 10% of the membership. And since the HOA had exactly 112 lots, that meant just 12 signatures could trigger a vote. So, I started collecting them. It didn't take long. By the end of the week, I had 19 signatures from homeowners eager to see Carol's reign come to an end. I drafted a proposal titled Reform of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association, which included fairer fine structures, limits on board authority, and, most importantly, a clause requiring annual elections for all officer positions, including the presidency. I filed the petition officially, which meant Carol had no choice but to hold a vote within 30 days. She wasn't happy. The day after the notice went out, she showed up at my gate again. This time she didn't bother with polite smiles. She marched up the gravel path, clipboard in hand, fury in her eyes. "You're trying to destroy this community," she shouted. "Do you have any idea how hard we've worked to maintain standards?" I stayed calm. "Standards are fine," I said. "Dictatorship isn't. You can't just bully people because their shutters aren't the right shade of beige." She jabbed a finger at me. "You don't belong here. You're not even one of us." I smiled. "According to the paperwork, I'm as much a member as you are. Maybe more, considering I actually read the bylaws." She stomped her foot like a child, then spun around and stormed off again. I watched her leave, knowing I'd hit a nerve. A week later, strange things started happening. Someone dumped trash bags at the edge of my fence. My mailbox got knocked over twice. A drone buzzed over my property late one night, hovering near the barn before zipping away. I wasn't paranoid, I knew exactly who was behind it. Carol had a habit of using anonymous tactics to intimidate people. But I had cameras installed, and I made sure they caught everything in crisp detail. Then came the big day, the reform vote. The clubhouse was packed that evening, even more than before. Homeowners filled every chair, every bit of standing room, whispering about the drama. Some had come just to see the showdown. I arrived early again, documents in hand, calm as ever. Carol sat up front, stone-faced, while Denise nervously shuffled papers beside her. The meeting began, and Carol immediately tried to undermine the vote. "This proposal," she said into the microphone, "is based on misinformation and a deliberate attempt to undermine community values." I raised my hand. "All due respect, Madam President, but the bylaws guarantee the right to member-initiated reform. You can't block it." The crowd murmured in agreement. Carol glared at me but continued. When the time came for discussion, one by one, residents stood up and shared their frustrations, the endless fines, the invasive inspections, the feeling of living under surveillance in what was supposed to be their own homes. I didn't have to say much. Carol's years of control had done the talking for me. By the time the votes were counted, the result was overwhelming. Reform passed by 78%. Carol looked like she'd been punched. Her control, her power, her iron grip, it all crumbled right there in front of everyone. But that wasn't the end. Part of the reform package required a new election for board positions. Carol tried to delay it, citing procedural concerns, but the bylaws were clear. Within 30 days, nominations were to be opened, and the membership would vote. Homeowners started whispering that I should run. At first, I laughed it off. I wasn't a politician. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If I really wanted to stop this nonsense, I had to get inside the system completely. So, I did. When nominations opened, I submitted my name for HOA president. Carol's expression when she saw my paperwork was priceless. "You're joking," she said, half laughing, half terrified. "Nope," I replied. "Dead serious." For the next 2 weeks, Silver Pines turned into a political battlefield. Carol went door to door, spreading rumors that I was planning to dismantle the HOA entirely, that I'd turn the neighborhood into a trailer park. I didn't stoop to her level. I just met people, listened to their complaints, and promised one thing: I'd restore sanity. Election night came fast. Votes were counted in the clubhouse again. It took nearly 2 hours, with Denise reading each ballot aloud while Carol sat stiffly beside her. When it was over, Denise looked up, voice trembling. By a vote of 61 to 49, she said, "The new president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association is Ethan Cole." The room erupted in applause. Carol stood up slowly, pale and silent, then turned and walked out without saying a word. Just like that, the balance shifted. The next morning, I drove into town, picked up a stack of new letterhead with my name printed at the top, Ethan Cole, President, Silver Pines HOA. It felt surreal. I'd gone from being the outsider everyone tried to push away to running the very organization that had harassed me. But I wasn't in it for revenge. I wanted to fix what had been broken for years. I canceled the ridiculous fines, ended the petty inspections, and held open forums so residents could actually voice concerns without fear. For the first time, people felt like they had control again. Still, part of me couldn't help but appreciate the irony. Carol had tried to rule over everyone, even those beyond her borders. Now, not only did she have to live under my rules, she had to watch as I turned her old empire into something decent. And the best part? I didn't just own the ranch anymore. I owned the HOA. The first few weeks as HOA president were eye-opening. You'd think people would be thrilled to see someone finally willing to fix the mess that Carol and her little entourage had created. And, for the most part, they were. I got more handshakes, thank you letters, and backyard barbecue invites in that month than I'd ever expected. The air around Silver Pines felt lighter, neighbors waving to one another again, kids riding bikes down the streets without parents worrying about code violations. But underneath that calm surface, the remnants of Carol's control still lingered like a stubborn weed that refused to die. Her old allies, the ones who'd enjoyed a bit of power or free leniency while she ruled, weren't happy about the change. And Carol herself wasn't gone, not by a long shot. I started every morning the same way, coffee on the porch, notebook in hand, making lists of everything that needed fixing: broken fencing near the pond, faded neighborhood signs, that old playground equipment that hadn't been safe for kids in years. It amazed me how the HOA had spent thousands on aesthetic improvements like branded flags and fountain lighting but ignored actual maintenance. I set up a budget audit and nearly fell out of my chair when I saw where the money had gone. Under Carol's administration, the board had approved consulting fees for projects that never existed, landscaping contracts for her cousin's company, even security patrols paid to her brother-in-law. It was corruption, small town, small scale, but real corruption nonetheless. The audit report became my first order of business. At the next board meeting, I laid everything out. The room was packed again. Word had spread that big revelations were coming. I stood at the podium, flipping through a stack of papers. For years, I said, our HOA has been running like a private club, not a community organization. Funds have been misused, maintenance ignored, and rules weaponized against residents. That stops today. I went line by line, reading the questionable expenses. Every few sentences, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mark, the old treasurer, sat in the corner, avoiding eye contact. Denise kept her head down, typing. And then I said it. According to our accountant's review, approximately $47,000 in HOA funds have been misallocated or unaccounted for over the past 3 years. These transactions link directly to companies owned or managed by Carol Bennett and her family. The reaction was explosive. Gasps, whispers, even a few angry shouts. I could feel the tension breaking apart, years of silent frustration. Carol wasn't there, she'd refused to attend since the election, but her name might as well have been carved into every sheet of that report. By the end of the meeting, the board unanimously voted to refer the findings to the county's Housing Oversight Office. For the first time, Silver Pines wasn't covering for her, they were confronting her. The next morning, my phone started ringing before sunrise. The first call was from the county inspector, confirming receipt of the report. The second was from a reporter at the local paper, the Maple Creek Chronicle. Word had gotten out faster than I expected. Mr. Cole, the reporter said, we understand you've uncovered significant misuse of HOA funds. Care to comment? I gave him a careful statement, just the facts, no drama. But the headline that came out the next day was brutal: former HOA president under investigation for financial misconduct. That headline hit Silver Pines like a thunderclap. For years, people had whispered about Carol's favoritism, her selective enforcement of rules, her obsession with control, but no one had ever dared say it out loud. Now, her name was plastered on the front page for everyone to see. By afternoon, she showed up at my ranch. I was repairing a fence post when I heard the crunch of gravel under tires. Her car, a spotless white Lexus, naturally, rolled up to the gate, and she stepped out, sunglasses on, fury radiating from every inch of her. She didn't even wait for me to come closer. You think you can humiliate me? She snapped. You don't know what you've started. I leaned against the fence calmly. Carol, all I did was expose what was already there. You did this to yourself. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You'll regret this. You think these people like you? They'll turn on you the moment you stop giving them what they want. Maybe, I said. But at least they'll be treated fairly. That's more than they got under you. She took a step closer, her voice dropping low. You don't belong here, Ethan. You never did. I built this community. I made it what it is. You mean what it was, I corrected. She glared for a long moment, then turned, slammed her car door, and sped off down the road, gravel spraying from her tires. I should have expected what came next. A week later, I started receiving anonymous complaints, this time filed against me. The county office got calls claiming I was operating a commercial farm without permits. Someone reported that I had hazardous waste stored in my barn. Even the sheriff's department got a tip that I had illegal livestock. It was laughable, but it still caused headaches. Deputies had to come out, inspect the place, file their reports. Each time, they found nothing. Jim, my friend from the department, stopped by one evening and said, "We know it's her. She's desperate. Just keep your paperwork tight." So I did. Every inch of that ranch was documented, licensed, and zoned correctly. I was bulletproof, and she hated it. Meanwhile, the community transformation continued. We repaired the playground, repainted the fences, and even organized a spring fair, the first one Silver Pines had held in years. The turnout was incredible. Kids ran through sprinklers, food trucks lined the street, and the air smelled like fresh barbecue and laughter. I stood near the entrance, watching it all unfold, and for the first time since I'd moved there, it actually felt like home. But Carol couldn't stand watching from the sidelines. She filed a lawsuit. When the papers arrived, I wasn't surprised. She accused me of defamation, abuse of power, and emotional distress. The irony nearly made me laugh out loud. My lawyer, Laura, just shook her head. "She's fishing," she said. "She's hoping you'll back down or settle." Don't. We didn't. The court date came 6 weeks later. The courthouse was small, just one of those old brick buildings with peeling paint and creaky floors. Carol sat at her attorney's table, perfectly dressed, hair immaculate, glaring at me like she could will me out of existence. The judge, a patient man who'd probably seen 100 neighbor disputes in his career, looked tired before we even began. Her attorney made a dramatic opening statement, painting her as a devoted community leader unfairly targeted by a vindictive outsider. When it was our turn, Laura stood up and methodically dismantled every claim. We presented financial records, HOA meeting minutes, and sworn statements from homeowners about her intimidation tactics. The judge listened, expressionless. By the end of the day, the case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning she couldn't file it again. As we walked out of the courtroom, Carol brushed past me, muttering under her breath, "This isn't over." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because, at that moment, it was over, for her. That evening, back at the ranch, I stood on my porch, watching the sunset. The sky burned orange and pink over the pines, and the wind carried the faint hum of laughter from the fairgrounds below. It hit me how far things had come, from those first threatening letters to now, where I wasn't just fighting to protect my land, but helping rebuild an entire neighborhood's spirit. Yet, as peaceful as that moment felt, I knew one thing for sure: people like Carol never disappear quietly. They linger, watching, waiting for a crack to reappear. And sure enough, she did come back, just not in the way I expected. 2 months later, the county issued a notice. Silver Pines HOA had an outstanding debt on a small lot near the south entrance, the old maintenance shed property. Apparently, years of unpaid taxes had piled up under Carol's tenure, and now it was going up for auction. When I saw the listing, I felt that same spark of irony that had started this whole mess. The HOA itself owed money. And as the acting president, I had the authority to bid. At the auction, there were only a few bidders, a couple of developers and one curious neighbor. I waited patiently as the price climbed slowly. When it hit $3,000, the others started dropping out. I raised my hand once more. "Sold," the auctioneer called. Just like that, I owned the HOA's maintenance lot outright, not as part of the association, but as a private purchase. It was a symbolic victory, but it meant more than that. You see, buried in the HOA's founding documents was a clause that allowed any property owner holding a majority interest in HOA assets to call for dissolution of the organization. And now, between the parcel I'd first bought and this one, I technically controlled over 50% of HOA property. For the first time, I had the power to end it entirely. That decision didn't come easy. I spent days thinking about it. On one hand, I'd finally turned the HOA into something fair, honest, and functional. People trusted me. The community had healed. On the other, the idea of shutting down the whole system, the same one that had caused so much misery, was tempting. One evening, I sat with Laura on the porch, going over the legal implications. If you dissolve it, she said, you'll free every homeowner from HOA dues, rules, and restrictions. But you'll also remove the maintenance structure. Roads, common areas, utilities, it all reverts to the county. Would that hurt anyone? I asked. She shrugged. Some folks might not like the change. Others will celebrate it. But legally? You can do it. That night, I drove through Silver Pines, slow and quiet. The streetlights glowed soft against the freshly painted curbs. Kids' laughter echoed in the cul-de-sacs. Neighbors waved as I passed. It struck me how different the place felt now, alive, real, unafraid. Maybe the HOA had served its purpose once upon a time, but now it was just a remnant of control that no one really needed anymore. So, the next morning, I filed the motion. Within 3 weeks, the paperwork cleared, and the Silver Pines Homeowners Association, the same organization that had called the cops on me, fined families for kids' toys, and tried to dictate my life, was officially dissolved. And here's the best part, the land and assets transferred to me as the majority owner, which meant the HOA no longer existed, but its former properties, its equipment, even its old clubhouse, belonged to me. Carol's empire was gone. And I literally owned what was left of it. After the HOA was officially dissolved, the air around Silver Pines changed in a way that's hard to describe unless you've lived through something like it. It felt as if the whole neighborhood had exhaled after holding its breath for years. No more warning letters taped to front doors. No more fines over mailbox colors or grass length. People were finally free to live their lives again. For the first time since I moved out there, I could drive through the streets without feeling that suffocating tension that always hung in the air. Kids' laughter filled the cul-de-sacs again, neighbors leaned over fences to talk instead of peering through blinds. The place was alive. But beneath that peace, there was also confusion. Some homeowners weren't sure what came next, what it meant to live in a neighborhood without an HOA. Others were nervous about the county taking over road maintenance or trash collection. So I held a meeting, an informal one this time, no podiums, no rules of order, just a group of neighbors gathered at the old clubhouse. I stood near the front, leaning against the wall, hands in my pockets. Look, I told them, I didn't dissolve the HOA to cause chaos. I did it because it stopped serving its purpose. But that doesn't mean we can't still take care of each other. I explained that while the HOA was gone, nothing was stopping them from forming a voluntary neighborhood council, one focused on collaboration instead of control. No fines, no board, just people helping maintain shared spaces and keeping the area safe. To my surprise, everyone agreed. They wanted something better too. We formed a small committee that night, 7 volunteers, including me, Tom and Laura from down the street, Amanda, and even Denise, the old HOA secretary, who admitted she'd felt pressured by Carol for years. It was the first time I saw her smile without looking nervous. We decided to keep the old clubhouse open for community events and fund its upkeep through voluntary contributions. And here's the thing, people actually donated more when they weren't forced to. Within a month, the whole neighborhood felt like a new place. The walls between people had come down. There were barbecues every other weekend, a book club started up, and kids built lemonade stands without anyone threatening to fine them for unapproved commercial activity. It was real community, the kind that thrives on respect, not fear. Meanwhile, I was still managing the old HOA assets that now legally belonged to me, the maintenance shed, a few empty parcels, and the clubhouse. I didn't want to profit off them, but I also didn't want them to go to waste. So I came up with an idea. I'd turn the clubhouse into a community co-op. We'd host events, workshops, and even small business markets there, giving locals a place to gather and grow. The transformation began fast. With volunteers' help, we repainted the walls, fixed the old flooring, and replaced the dated furniture with stuff people donated. The first event we held there was a farmer's market, and it was a hit. Families brought homemade jams, crafts, candles, and fresh vegetables. The smell of grilled corn and coffee filled the air. I walked through the crowd, shaking hands, listening to people laugh and barter. It was beautiful, simple, real, and nothing like the rigid world Carol had built. But not everyone was happy about it. 2 weeks later, as I was locking up the clubhouse after another event, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt near the south entrance. They weren't from anyone I knew. The next morning, I found graffiti sprayed on the maintenance shed, "Traitor." It was written in red paint, the letters jagged and angry. My gut told me exactly who was behind it. Carol had vanished from public life since her lawsuit failed, but people whispered that she'd moved out of Silver Pines to stay with her sister a few towns over. Still, I knew that kind of bitterness doesn't just disappear. I didn't call the cops. I just cleaned it up. But the next incident wasn't as easy to brush off. One evening, just after sunset, I was in the barn finishing some repairs when I heard something outside, soft footsteps on gravel. I turned off the saw, listening. Then came the faint crunch again, closer this time. I stepped out into the fading light, scanning the yard. The gate was closed, and everything looked still. For a moment, I thought maybe it was an animal. But then I caught a flicker of movement near the fence line. Someone ducked behind a tree. "Who's there?" I called out. No response. I started walking toward the fence, my boots crunching in the dirt. The air was heavy with pine and tension. When I reached the tree, I saw a dark figure dart away through the brush. I didn't chase them, it wasn't worth it, but I knew then that whoever it was, they'd been watching. The next morning, I found a folded note wedged under my truck's windshield wiper. No name, no signature, just 3 words, scrawled in shaky handwriting: "You ruined everything." I called Jim, told him about the incidents. He came by that afternoon, looked at the note, and sighed. "She's losing it," he said quietly. "But unless she crosses a line, there's not much we can do." So I doubled down on security. Cameras, motion lights, locks, all top-notch. I wasn't scared, exactly, but I wasn't stupid either. Weeks passed, and things gradually returned to normal. The co-op grew, people kept showing up, and the ranch stayed peaceful. I almost started to believe that Carol had finally let it go, until one night in early summer, when everything changed again. It was a little past midnight when I woke to the sound of sirens. At first, I thought they were far off, maybe on the main road. But then the flashing red and blue lights painted my bedroom walls. I jumped out of bed, threw on a shirt, and ran to the window. 2 sheriff's cruisers had stopped at my gate. Heart pounding, I went outside. Jim was there, along with another deputy I didn't recognize. "What's going on?" I asked. Jim's face was grim. "We got a call about a fire." "A fire?" He pointed toward the old clubhouse. Through the trees, I saw it, orange flames licking the roof, smoke billowing into the night sky. I grabbed my keys and jumped in the truck. By the time I reached the lot, firefighters were already working to contain it. The scene looked surreal, neighbors standing in their pajamas, eyes wide with disbelief, the smell of burning wood thick in the air. The clubhouse, our co-op, our community symbol, was engulfed in flames. The next few hours were chaos. Thankfully, no one was hurt. The fire crew managed to stop it before it spread to nearby homes, but the building was a total loss. When the smoke finally cleared, all that was left was a charred skeleton of beams and ash. The fire marshal stayed late into the night, inspecting the remains. Around dawn, he approached me with a clipboard. "We'll have to run tests," he said, "but off the record, it looks like arson." My stomach turned. "Any signs of who?" He shook his head. "Too early to say. But whoever did it knew what they were doing. Accelerant in multiple spots." I didn't have to guess long. 2 days later, the county sheriff's office got a tip. Someone had seen a car leaving the area right before the fire started, a white Lexus. Jim called me personally. "You're not gonna like this," he said. We traced the plate. It was registered to Carol Bennett. When they brought her in for questioning, she didn't deny being there. She just said, "I wanted to see what he'd built on the ashes of my community." But the evidence was too strong: residue on her clothes, gas receipts, eyewitness accounts. It all lined up. The trial was swift. The prosecutor painted a clear picture: former HOA president, humiliated and bitter, retaliates against the man who exposed her corruption. Her lawyer tried to spin it as emotional distress, but no one bought it. When the verdict came down, guilty of arson and property destruction, the courtroom was silent. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. I sat through the sentencing, watching her stare straight ahead, expression hollow. When the judge gave her 3 years in county jail, she didn't flinch. Just before they led her away, she turned her head slightly, eyes meeting mine. "You took everything from me," she whispered. I didn't respond. Because in truth, I hadn't taken anything she hadn't already thrown away. After the fire, rebuilding took time. The community was shaken, but not broken. People came together stronger than before, donating labor, materials, and money. Within 6 months, the old clubhouse lot was cleared, and construction began on a new structure, a hybrid space that would serve as a community center, library nook, and small farmers market. We named it Silver Pines Commons. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. When the ribbon-cutting day came, hundreds showed up. The sun was bright, the air filled with music and laughter. I stood near the entrance, the same spot where Carol had once stood, but this time there was no tension, no fear, just unity. During the ceremony, Denise handed me the scissors. "You started this," she said softly. "You should do the honors." As the ribbon fluttered to the ground and the crowd cheered, I felt something shift deep inside me. For the first time, it wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about peace, real, earned peace. Silver Pines wasn't perfect. It probably never would be. But it was finally what it should have been all along, a neighborhood, not a battleground. And me? I was just the guy who happened to buy a ranch in the wrong place at the right time. Or maybe the right place at the wrong time. Either way, I'd found my purpose. The year after we opened Silver Pines Commons was one of the most peaceful and rewarding times of my life. The air around the ranch carried a calm rhythm now. Mornings started with coffee on the porch as mist rolled across the pasture, and afternoons were filled with the steady hum of life returning to the community. I'd walk through the market every Saturday, chatting with neighbors, watching families fill the courtyard that once sat empty under the HOA's watchful eye. The ghosts of the past still lingered in some corners, but they were quieter now, drowned out by laughter, by music, by the clinking of mason jars and kids' running footsteps. I didn't think much about the HOA anymore. It was gone, burned to ash both legally and literally. But the lessons it left behind stayed with me. Power, when unchecked, will always rot, whether it's in the hands of a politician, a corporation, or a neighborhood president with too much time and too little empathy. Carol had been the warning sign that people ignored until it was too late. The system had enabled her, and for a long time, we'd all gone along because it was easier to stay quiet than to speak up. I'd learned that silence, in its own way, is complicity. After the fire and the trial, the county officials reached out to me about the land and the HOA assets that had reverted to my ownership. They wanted to know what I planned to do with the remaining lots, a few acres of undeveloped space on the east side near the creek. They assumed I'd sell it, maybe to a developer or some new homeowner. But I had other ideas. I wanted that land to mean something again. So, I turned it into a public trail. With a few volunteers, we cleared the brush, laid down gravel, and built wooden signs with maps of the route. It wound through the pines, across the creek, and up a gentle slope that overlooked the whole neighborhood. I called it Freedom Trail. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. It became the place where people walked their dogs, jogged at sunrise, or sat quietly to watch the sunset. I'll never forget one particular evening out there, early autumn, leaves turning gold and red, the sun dipping low. I was standing by the overlook when an older man I'd never met before stopped beside me. He was holding a walking stick, wearing a faded baseball cap. "You're the guy who used to own the HOA, right?" he asked, not unkindly. "Technically, yeah," I said with a laugh. He nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. "You know, I've lived here for 20 years. This place, it used to be nice, then it turned into something ugly. But what you did, what all of you did, you brought it back." I didn't know what to say. Sometimes silence speaks louder than anything. He tapped the ground with his stick and smiled. "Keep it that way, son." That moment stuck with me. Months went by, and the community continued to grow in ways I hadn't imagined. Local high school students started using the commons for art fairs and charity drives. Retirees offered free classes, woodworking, gardening, even basic home repair. It wasn't perfect, there were still arguments, petty squabbles, the usual human mess, but it was real. It was earned. Every so often, people asked me if I missed the simplicity of my old life before all the chaos. Before the HOA drama, before the legal battles, before the endless meetings and late-night stress. The truth? Sometimes I did. There were nights when I'd sit by the fire and think about how much time, money, and energy I'd spent just trying to do the right thing. But then I'd look around, at my land, my neighbors, this patch of peace we'd built, and I knew I wouldn't change a thing. Life on the ranch had its own quiet rhythm. The horses were getting older, but they still trotted to the fence every morning when I came out with feed. The barn smelled like hay and sawdust and a faint trace of coffee, the smell of routine, of something grounded. I started writing again, just small things, notes about the journey, about community, about what it means to stand your ground. I didn't plan to publish them, but it helped me make sense of everything that happened. Sometimes, I'd drive past the old HOA office downtown, or what used to be the office. It had been converted into a pet grooming shop. Seeing it made me smile. The walls that once held endless arguments over grass length and mailbox colors were now echoing with the sound of barking dogs and laughter. It was poetic, in a way, life repurposed from control to care. Jim still dropped by the ranch now and then. He'd pull up in his truck, boots dusty from the field, and we'd sit on the porch drinking beer and reminiscing. "You know," he said one afternoon, "I've seen a lot of disputes in my time, neighbors, family, business partners. But I've never seen someone take down an HOA from the inside like you did." I laughed. "I didn't take it down. Carol did that herself. I just happened to be holding the mirror." He grinned, tipping his hat back. "Well, let's hope nobody else around here ever needs to learn that lesson again." As winter approached, the ranch grew quieter. Snow blanketed the fields, muffling the sounds of the world. The pines stood still and heavy, branches sagging under white weight. I found peace in that stillness, a kind of closure I hadn't realized I was missing. On Christmas Eve, the community held a small gathering at the Commons. The new building glowed with string lights and wood smoke. Kids ran around in scarves, holding cups of hot chocolate. Someone played acoustic guitar near the fire pit. I stood off to the side, watching it all unfold, when Denise came over with 2 mugs of cider. She handed me one and smiled. "You did good, you know." I shook my head. "We did good." She chuckled. Still, not every man can say he owned an HOA and actually made people happy afterward. That made us both laugh, the kind of deep, genuine laugh that comes only after surviving something hard together. As the night went on, people began sharing stories, not about the HOA, not about lawsuits or drama, but about the friendships they'd made since it all ended. A couple talked about how they met at one of the markets. A teenager thanked everyone for helping raise money for his college tuition. An elderly woman said she'd never felt safer living alone because now, if anything happened, she knew the neighbors would show up. I realized then that this was what a community was supposed to be. Not a hierarchy, not a system of control, but a web of people who looked out for one another. When I finally headed home that night, the stars were out, glittering above the dark silhouette of the pines. I stopped at the edge of the trail, where a small wooden sign read, "Freedom Trail," dedicated to the people of Silver Pines, who chose community over control. I traced my fingers over the letters and smiled. It felt like the perfect ending to a story that had started with a simple mistake, buying a ranch in the wrong neighborhood. And yet, that mistake had turned into the best decision I ever made. It taught me that peace isn't given, it's built. That sometimes, standing your ground means more than just defending your property, it means defending your right to live free, with dignity and decency. In the end, I didn't just buy land. I bought back something priceless, the soul of a community. And though I technically owned the HOA once upon a time, it was never about ownership. It was about stewardship, about rebuilding something that had been twisted by greed and fear into something good again. Now, every morning when I wake up and see the sunrise spill across the ranch, I remember how far we've come. From the day those cops showed up at my gate because the HOA couldn't handle losing control, to now, a place reborn from fire and stubborn hope. The world doesn't hand you peace. You make it, one hard choice at a time. And as I stand here, listening to the wind move through the pines and the faint hum of laughter drifting from the Commons, I know one thing for certain, this is home. For good.